Hello and welcome to this webinar, which is hosted by the PETA International Science Consortium and Chemical Watch. I'm Christopher Fassbender, a science advisor for the Science Consortium. This webinar describes the perspectives on the development, evaluation, and application of in silico approaches for predicting toxicity. Next slide, please. The PETA International Science Consortium is an organization that promotes reliable and relevant regulatory testing approaches that protect human health and the environment, while eliminating the use of animals. We have teamed up with Chemical Watch, a leading global regulatory news and information service for the chemical industry, to present a free webinar series focusing on non-animal methods and testing strategies that can be used to meet REACH requirements. This series updates the popular 2014 to 2015 webinar series and reflects the significant progress in the use and acceptance of non-animal methods that has occurred in recent years. Next slide, please. Around 1 million animals have already been used for REACH purposes, yet there are provisions within REACH to minimize animal testing. For Annexes 7 and 8 in particular, there are excellent alternative methods that can be used to meet REACH data requirements. It is with this in mind that the Science Consortium has made minimizing animal testing for REACH requirements a high priority. If you check out our website, you will see that we have a page dedicated to promoting alternative methods to meet REACH requirements. I'd also like to let you know that our scientists are available to assist registrants in avoiding animal testing, so please feel free to get in touch with us if you need advice on how to use the alternative methods discussed during these webinars. This webinar focuses on the use of QSARs and read-across, as these are core methods that can be used to minimize testing for all endpoints. And the presenters will also consider the use of integrated approaches to testing and assessment and adverse outcome pathways. The other webinars in this series address specific Annex 7 and 8 endpoints, including skin irritation and corrosion, serious eye damage and irritation, and skin sensitization. These webinars will be of interest to industry toxicologists, those registering chemicals, REACH consultants, and companies who would like to know more about validated non-animal tests and how companies are using them. Next slide, please. I'll now introduce our speakers so they can present what I know will be an extremely informative presentation. Dr. Grace Patlewicz is a research chemist at the US Environmental Protection Agency's National Center for Computational Toxicology, and Dr. Mark Cronin is a professor of predictive toxicology at the School of Pharmacy and Chemistry at Liverpool John Moores University. They are going to present jointly on how read-across and QSARs can be used for regulatory purposes. Mark, over to you.
Thank you very much, Chris. And my name is Mark Cronin from Liverpool John Moores University, and I'm delighted to share this webinar with Grace Patlewicz. And we'll be doing a double act, so I will pass over to Grace occasionally. In the next slide, we'll just discuss some of the regulatory drivers for the use of these computational or in silico methods that we're going to discuss a little bit in this webinar. And the webinar has been put in the context of current legislation and indeed future legislation and the regulation that underpins it. And of course, at the heart of that is the need to have safer and sustainable chemicals and to understand the potential risk and hazard associated with those. And historically, we have a large amount of legislation that's been supported by toxicity testing and various assessment frameworks. However, as you've heard, we're now moving into an era where there is an expectation and indeed a need to conduct tests with fewer animals and perform them more rapidly. And this is partly because of the number of testing requirements that are needed, and also the challenges of the regulatory programs across the world. So, for instance, within the European Union, we have some specific legislation. Firstly, to say, of course, that alternatives to animal testing is actively promoted in the European Union. And we also have specific regulation, for instance, for the cosmetic sector, that prohibits animal testing on any new ingredient. We also coming to the end now of the REACH legislation, the Registration, Evaluation, Authorization and Restriction of Chemicals, and that's been a large review of existing chemicals and the relative risks associated with them. And within that, many of you will know that there are specific requirements for information based on relative tonnage and use profiles. However, whilst that may be seen to promote the use of animal testing, there is a clear need within the REACH legislation to do away with animal testing and to use non-testing approaches where possible. Next slide, please. We're also seeing outside of Europe that REACH-like schemes are also being established in other nations. They're becoming apparent in China, in South Korea, and also in Turkey. Also in the US, a similar piece of legislation, the Frank-Lautenberg Chemical Safety for the 21st Century Act, requires risk-based prioritization for many compounds within commerce. And this may be even more ambitious than REACH, covering some 80,000 compounds. And inevitably within those, the vast majority will not have sufficient publicly available or any toxicity information. Therefore, the LCSA, the new US regulation, does require and does mandate the need for alternatives to reduce and refine animal testing. Elsewhere, we see risk-based prioritization as part of regulatory frameworks in Canada, their domestic substance list, and also elsewhere, such as Australia, Japan, and Europe. So there is a great requirement supported by legislation to produce non-animal alternatives, of which we will begin to discuss in this webinar. Next slide. With this in mind, the aims of this particular webinar are to review the use of non-testing approaches and focus particularly on the so-called in silico approaches, and we'll briefly describe the use of QSAR and read across. And we'll put this in a historical context and also how they can be used for regulatory use. We'll also provide a very brief overview to the so-called IATA, or integrated approaches to testing and assessment, and how approaches like QSAR and in silico tests, as well as in vitro tests, fit into IATA. And we'll also put IATA into the context of the upcoming use of TOX21 type data, and how adverse outcome pathways can help to inform IATA and develop them with particular emphasis, in this case, on supportive evidence for read across. Next slide, please. So this webinar will be in two parts. The first part is dedicated to in silico approaches, and we'll start off with some basic definitions of SAR and QSAR, and then talk a little bit more about grouping approaches, categories, and how read across is performed. Later, as part of this, Grace Patlewicz will talk to us about the frameworks that can be used to develop and assess read across, as well as tools that you may want to use and where this whole area is going. Next slide. In the second part of the webinar, we'll focus a little more on the IATA, how to perform them, the mechanistic basis through the use of AOPs, and focus in, and Grace in particular will focus in on defined approaches and IATA for skin sensitization, and again supported by AOPs. Next slide. So in part one, I'm going to focus here on the use of so-called in silico or computational approaches. And in the next slide, we just summarize the approaches that can be used. And actually, computational toxicology now encompasses a wide variety of approaches, ranging from the use of existing databases, where we capture current information, some of which are publicly available, some of which may be confidential business information. We're going to focus here on the 4 bullet points in red, so category formation, read across, structure activity and quantitative structure activity relationships, and how they are formalized into usable expert systems. But also in modern 21st century toxicology, we incorporate aspects of bioinformatics, chemoinformatics, and increasingly the need for biokinetics modeling, such as the use of physiologically based pharmacokinetic type models and all sorts of pharmacokinetic models. But we're focusing here on the bullet points in red. And next slide, please. As a whole, and next slide, as a whole, these are termed non-testing approaches. So within this webinar, we'll be describing or using the term non-testing approaches, in part to indicate in silico type approaches, but also occasionally to indicate the use of in vitro type data. So next slide. Starting from the most simplistic way of considering this, what we're interested in computational toxicology, or our aspect of toxicology, computational toxicology today, is the relationship between chemical structure and toxicology. And this has been known for many, many decades, that the structure of a chemical is the driving force of the toxicological action. And over the years, much of this information has been captured. And what we're showing here in this slide is a publication that is now 30 years old, but it was one of the first that drew together about 20 so-called structural alerts, in this case for genotoxic carcinogenicity, in terms of chemical fragments. The reference is given there, John Ashby and Ray Tennant. And the large molecule on the right, if you look closely, you'll see structural alerts which we're now very familiar with, such as aromatic amines, aromatic nitro groups, epoxides, and so forth, all of which are associated with, in this case, mutagenicity. The theory here is that if we see these types of structures in a further molecule that may not be tested, we may be able to assume that the toxicological effect will be the same. So this is a structure-activity relationship, and the structural fragments are commonly referred to as structural alerts. In the next slide, we can show that we can also have so-called quantitative structure-activity relationships. And again, this is a science that has been used since the 1960s, and particularly in toxicology since the 1980s. And here we're trying to put some aspect of potency into our relationship and capture that with a physicochemical property or structural descriptor. So commonly used descriptors may be measures of hydrophobicity, such as octanol water partitioning, polarity, or measures of chemical reactivity or chemical size. And we can use these to predict. On the left, you have a classic regression analysis type approach to predict potency. And here we have a single property that may be related to activity. This is commonly seen with narcotic type potency and hydrophobicity. Or we may be able to develop qualitative models using quantitative data. Here we're developing a model, or we have a model that's able to separate out toxic from non-toxic compounds. These are very simplistic representations of QSAR, and many different approaches have been used historically. And if you look into the literature, you'll see a vast number of different techniques and statistical methods. Next slide. For the user of a QSAR, often you'll want to go straight to a piece of software that is going to enable you to enter a chemical structure and draw the chemical or the result for that chemical out from it. Many of these are termed expert systems, and they allow a user to use the knowledge mainly of an expert or a model derived from an expert to make a prediction based on structure alone. So there are many different types of expert systems, and so for instance we have some based on traditional QSAR approaches. There's Acceleris developed the ToxCast system, LeadScope from LeadScope Inc. Some systems are based on expert knowledge captured as structural alerts within structure-activity relationships. Derek Nexus from NASA Limited is an example of this, as is ToxTree, which is a freely downloadable piece of software from the European Commission's Joint Research Centre. And some software is a hybrid of both structural alerts and more quantitative models. For instance, Times from Laboratory of Mathematical Chemistry in Burgas in Bulgaria, or ChemTunes from Molecular Networks in Nuremberg in Germany. I should say and emphasize there are many other pieces of software and expert systems able to predict toxicity. We'll mention a few of these, and Grace will also give some examples of tools to read across later in this presentation. Next slide, please. What we're interested in this webinar is the regulatory use of QSARs. And I should also say that they used it in many other environments within product development and prioritization of compounds for lead development. And QSARs aim to package knowledge in a mature way so that, as I said, people and user can gain knowledge from themselves from that particular piece of software. There's a number of applications. We'll focus here on data gap filling, so to provide a direct prediction of ecotox or toxicological endpoint. Also, there's many models for fate, environmental fate, and physicochemical properties. And this is as a direct replacement for testing. We can also use computational methods to help us understand spurious results in experimental data, and they're quite often a useful tool and has enabled us to rationalize poor experimental data or even erroneous experimental data. And they can also provide, as we'll see, a component to a weight of evidence to help understand a particular decision. QSARs and SARs are essential for the development of read-across justifications. We'll hear more about that, and have often been used to understand chemical similarity, leading hopefully onto mechanistic similarity. And as I've alluded to, overall computational methods do provide another line of evidence, or provide weight of evidence within the context of IATA, which we'll hear about later. Next slide. So some of particularly current experiences of using QSAR approaches, and here we can gain a lot of information from how they've been used, for instance, for the European REACH legislation, but also many other legislations, and I'm thinking particularly within the US and how they're used in the pre-manufacturing notification procedures as replacements. And QSARs are most promising for certain physicochemical, ecotoxin, environmental properties. So we have good and freely available predictors for oxygenol water partition coefficient, for endpoints such as acute fish toxicity, particularly for narcotic or unreactive chemicals, and also for ready biodegradability. And those models are freely available, easy to use, and in certain circumstances, widely accepted. QSARs can also provide, as we've heard, supporting information to build up a weight of evidence. And here we can use them in more complex, particularly mammalian endpoints, such as eye and skin irritation, and they're widely used as well to identify potentially genotoxic and mutagenic type chemicals. However, when we get to the most complex, particularly mammalian endpoints, such as repeated dose toxicity, reproductive and developmental toxicities, the current use of QSAR is not necessarily good enough to make a valid prediction, but will provide, or has the possibility of providing, evidence that can form the weight of evidence. and also can be used as part of a read-across approach within a particular category and analog. And we'll build on that concept when we come to read across and the formation of categories, apologies. Next slide. So as we use QSARs and results from QSARs for regulatory applications, we need to understand how and why they can be accepted. And it's not simply a question of just simply using a piece of software, taking the results and reporting that. We need to understand the properties of the QSAR model itself and be able to document those and justify them. And also, we need to be able to put this in the context of what is required, both for the endpoint prediction, but for the use of the legislation and particular environment it is taken in. An important point under REACH is, and we have the direct quote here, the results obtained from a QSAR approach may be used instead of testing when following conditions are met. And this is to indicate the presence or absence of a certain property. And here we need to justify why our QSAR prediction may be useful to be used and may be valid. And in the graphic we have below, we have three important components we need to consider. First of all, we have to consider that our model is scientifically valid. And to do that, we have a set of principles in which to assess the potential validity of a model and then also document it. And I will discuss those in subsequent slides. Secondly, we must assume, or we must be able to demonstrate that the model we're using is applicable to the chemical for which we're making a prediction. And this means that we need to consider the applicability domain of the model. So is the chemical of interest similar to the chemicals within the models themselves? And finally, we need to ensure that the QSAR model is relevant to the regulatory purpose. So is it producing a prediction that is relevant for the particular registration or regulation that's considered? And if we get all of these criteria to meet, we can, in the center here, we say we have an adequate QSAR result. So QSAR result would be termed adequate if it is from a scientifically valid model. That model is, or the chemical is within the applicability domain of the model, and that model is relevant for regulatory purposes. And at that point, the prediction can be documented in terms of the QSAR prediction reporting format. So some of these aspects we'll now build upon in the next slides. Next slide, please. So we have a framework in order to assess QSARs, which has been very widely applied, which are the so-called OECD principles for QSAR validation. And these were agreed by the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, in 2004, and guidance was subsequently published, and much has been written and said about them. Despite them being over a decade old now, they're still valid and they're still very widely applied. And these state that a QSAR should be associated with the following 5 pieces of information. Firstly, a defined endpoint in terms of something that is relevant to the regulatory purpose. Secondly, an unambiguous algorithm, so an equation or a relationship that is transparent and comprehensible. Thirdly, a defined applicability domain. So this is our concept of the chemistry and other factors that define the space of our model. Fourthly, appropriate measures of the goodness of fit, robustness and productivity of a model, describing its performance both internally and ideally to a test set that the model has not been exposed to previously. And finally, if possible, a mechanistic interpretation. And that enables us to give some credibility and validity to the model as appropriate. On the next slide, we just highlight that we're going to focus in now on the concept of applicability domain. So next slide, please. So the applicability domain, we saw that was one of our three main components in understanding a prediction. And the general principle is that the molecule or the chemical of interest must fall within the applicability domain of the particular model. So that means we need a way of characterizing the distinct nature of a particular model. And there are a number of techniques that are used to characterize the model. The most obvious is the range and types of descriptors. So for instance, if we have a model based on a range of log P, then our chemical should fit within that. But it also should contain the same types of structural fragments and fingerprints, structural molecular structural features. There should be an understanding, if possible, of metabolism, and we should be able to see common information on metabolism, and also commonality in mechanism of action. So this becomes rather, or can become rather, a complex issue to both document this and understand it for a particular model and the different types of models, but also to apply that to the chemical of interest. There are, however, a number of tools that help you assess applicability domain and what will enable you to describe the domain itself. There's a couple listed there. The Laboratory of Mathematical Chemistry from Burgas in Bulgaria have a tool called the Domain Manager. Ambit Discovery, which has been developed in part through CEFIC funding and through IDEA Consulta in Sofia in Bulgaria, also have a tool for that. And many other types of software will consider applicability domain. Those are not the only two. Next slide, please. So based around the concept of the applicability domain was the so-called QSAR model reporting format. And this was developed after the QSAR principles, but based upon them to help a user describe and summarize the information within a QSAR model. And it comes as a harmonized template. And these become particularly valuable for regulatory submissions of QSAR predictions, as they allow the user to make a description of the QSAR model and justify the model, and include information such as the training set and statistics and all other descriptive information. There are a couple of freely available editors which enable a user and take the user through this particular format. And it does take a short amount of time to do this, but then one has a permanent record and a justification and a structured approach to describing a particular QSAR. So this now fulfills another of our criteria for obtaining a scientifically valid prediction. Next slide. Finally, in terms of reporting the scientifically valid prediction, there is a QSAR prediction reporting format, again, that is freely available, and there's a couple of links there that will take you to it. And again, this is a harmonized template, and the aim here is to allow the user both to report a QSAR prediction, but then refer back to the type of model and the information. In part, it's based around requirements for legislation such as REACH. So it gives an opportunity to record information on the substance itself. And here, care really is required in recording the chemical structure as accurately as possible and definitively as possible, but also general information about who's done the prediction and how the prediction was performed, and other information from the OECD principles. There's also an opportunity to include a comment or an assessment of the adequacy of a particular prediction or estimate. Next slide, please. Here we've tried to pull together some other types of QSAR resources, many of which, in fact all of which here are freely available. When you start to work in this area, you will appreciate there are many resources and many techniques that can be used, and this is not a comprehensive list, and I should make that clear. However, we do have useful resources such as the European Commission's Joint Research Centre has a QSAR model inventory, and that allows you to search for QSARs that have been recorded using that model reporting format within a particular inventory. So those are, if you want, ready-made QSARs. We're also seeing other efforts to record QSARs, such as QSAR DB, which is an initiative out of the University of Tartu in Estonia, and that's providing a repository and a growing repository for usable QSAR models. Other resources include OCHEM, which is a resource for developing QSARs, but also accessing publicly available data sets. And there's also other facilities there, such as inventories of structural alerts, particularly relating to toxicology. We're also seeing other types of initiatives, more modern, including the USA EPA's Chemistry Dashboard. And this is something that has evolved very recently and allows a user not only to look for existing data, but also to put these in the context of any ToxCast data, to search for physical and other properties, but also to make predictions. So it involves a large amount of information. And many of us are still beginning to use this now and beginning to understand the strength of this integrated approach of putting a lot of information together. Next slide. And here we have, for those of you interested in the US EPA dashboard, here we have the URL for it and some of the numbers associated. So it pulls on current information for about 750,000 substances, along with estimates. You can also make further estimates of physicochemical properties. And for these, you have ready-made QMRFs, so these reporting formats. And next slide. And next slide. These two screenshots show some of the output, in this case for bisphenol A. So it's easy to enter a structure into it through SMALs, through chemical drawing packages, and you will then be able to open up information, and on the right-hand side you will see the types of information that you will get. So here it's showing the octanol water partition coefficient. You can also go and get other physicochemical properties and start to draw upon as well toxicological information, as well as the more recent Tox 21 type information. Next slide. Now we're going to move on from use of QSARs and SARs more into the area of category formation and read across. And a couple of definitions here. Firstly, you will hear the term analog approach being used, and this is often used on to relate to a very small number of chemicals, typically a target chemical and a source substance, so two chemicals alone, one of which you may have information for, which you're reading across to your target chemical, for which you may not have information for. The category approach is more commonly associated when there are larger categories, 3 or more members, and here we're looking for quite often a trend within the category, as may be based upon a particular physicochemical property. So within these relatively small groups of chemicals, what we're trying to do is read across, and this enables us to read across toxicological information from one or more chemicals to those chemicals that do not have information. and so help fill gaps in our toxicological information. Key to this, as defined through the OECD and many others, is the concept of chemical similarity or other aspects of similarity. And to enable us to be able to use read across, we need to ensure that we have similar chemicals, and we're going to discuss some of the aspects of similarity here, and also some of the problems and how we can support arguments to assess chemical similarity. Next slide. So here we have a very commonly used graphic that originated from Andrew Worth at the Joint Research Centre and his group there, that just shows the type of processes that we can undergo. So at the top of the diagram here, which includes information on properties in this case, first for property 1, the first row just indicates effectively an analog approach, where information represented by the filled green dot can be read across to fill a gap for the chemical 2 without information. If we were to use information for property 2, 2 chemicals, then it's a process of interpolation. When we have more data or further data as we go down the plot here, and we can relate those particularly to a molecular property or descriptor, then we're entering back into the world of trend analysis, or if we have sufficient data, into QSAR. But the concept here is that for chemicals where we know there is some form of chemical or other similarity, that we can use, or we can fill in missing data through knowledge of existing data for chemicals. Next slide. And there is a large number of uses, of documented uses of read across. And indeed, quite famously, within the REACH legislation, read across was said to be used much more frequently than QSAR. And there's some debate here about whether this was truly the case, or whether some read across approaches were, whether some QSAR approaches were incorrectly documented as read across. There's lots of other examples of where read across has been used aside from the REACH legislation. We're seeing it as the solution, as I said earlier in the webinar, for complex endpoints, such as to support the cosmetics regulation, but also often used by the US EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, as part of their package of data for provisional peer-reviewed toxicity values where data may be lacking. Also, EPA uses it for test rules to see whether information provided by industry may satisfy a particular rule. As I alluded to earlier as well, it's also used widely within the pre-manufacturer notification scheme in the US EPA, and very commonly QSARs such as those within EPI-Suite and EPI-Win are used to predict environmental fate and ecotox properties. But we're also seeing an increased use of read across, again, to supplement those predictions. Other uses, not necessarily strictly regulatory, ASTDR use or read across to make a very rapid assessment when, for instance, there's an accidental spill or there's an emergency response required. Next slide. So as we think more about how read across is performed, there are two ways in which we may consider this. And the use of read across, as we'll see, is largely driven by the context, or needs to be, the decision to use read across needs to be made in the context in which it's used. So here we have two different types of approaches. And really, I've been discussing the so-called bottom-up approach, where we have an initial target chemical, and we're attempting to form that into provide an analog structure or form a small category. But you also may have a situation where you're prioritizing a large inventory. This may be a regulatory inventory. It may be an industry's own inventory. Categorize that and form relevant groupings within that. So we should bear in mind, depending on the context in which we use read across, we may go from a bottom up of starting small and aiming to form categories from that, or dissecting out categories from within a large potential inventory. Next slide. So as I said, when one starts a read across assessment, there's a number of decisions one needs to make. I've spoken initially there in the previous slide on the role of read across and what one is trying to achieve with it. But also one needs to consider a number of other issues. For instance, how confident do you need to be in your decision? So a decision for risk assessment may require a greater scientific confidence and evidence and weight of evidence than that for prioritization, as an example. You also need to consider how many data gaps one needs to fill. Is it a single chemical? Are you talking about assessing a category? And for which endpoints? So as I said, certain endpoints may require further work or further evidence due to their complexity than others. So an assessment of repeated dose toxicity may require a more detailed and thorough analysis than for other endpoints. Do you have data to support your read across on which to anchor the read across prediction? And when you enter into a read across, are you doing this blind, or are you able to put a hypothesis together to group substances? And ideally, your hypothesis will be based around a mechanism of action. Further issues include, is it credible to do the read across assessment for the hazard for the substance in question? So one needs to post rationalize the read across, and also consider what are the consequences of the read across not being accepted if this is for regulatory use. So that may be that further information is required, which may require potentially in vitro or other types of testing. So with these in mind, these questions in mind, it's worth just considering the types of grouping that we have. And in the next slide, I've summarized 3 of the main types of grouping. I think naturally, anyone with any chemical background will think in terms of structural analogues as being important for or the easiest way of creating a grouping. And here we just have some aliphatic alcohols, and they do form a valid group. But clearly what you would expect here is, whilst the toxicology may stay the same in terms of toxicodynamics, you will see big differences due to the change in chain length as a result of toxicokinetics. Other ways of grouping molecules are mechanistic analogues. The middle 4 compounds there all have a common alpha beta unsaturated carbonyl group, or can be metabolized to it. And these can be grouped together. These are actually all 4 skin sensitizers, and can be grouped together on the basis not of structural analogues, but of, in this case, having the same mechanistic grouping. That's quite subtle. Even more subtle is the development of mode of action analogues. And here you have 4 substances that bind very efficiently to the estrogen receptor and may be associated with endocrine disruption. And here now you're looking for different types of evidence that may support mode of action analogues, and that may bring you into areas such as biological read across to be supported by Tox21 type data. On the next slide are further potential groupings that are in some way related. Substances that may be metabolized to a common molecule may be grouped together. And indeed, there are some good examples here of where the read across has been performed on that common molecule, on the common metabolite itself. And again, justification may be required for that. And in a similar way, if compounds are degraded abiotically to a common product, then that may be a means of grouping, and that has also been done. So it is actually the fact that the grouping of molecules might be based on one of these types of groupings, or indeed more than one of these types of groupings, and you may be able to justify mechanistically different types of analogues in different approaches. And this is where the expert approach is required. So I'm going to hand over now to my co-speaker, Grace Patlewicz, and she's going to tell you a little bit more about how to develop a read-across assessment.
Thanks, Mark. So we've kind of outlined a number of different ways in which chemicals can be grouped together, these different types of groupings, and Mark's helpfully sort of outlined and defined what we mean by analog and category and read across in itself. And here what I want to show is really sort of, you know, what might be some of the practical aspects of going through a workflow and trying to develop a read across assessment in practice. So here we've just sort of outlined a number of the available guidance and other sort of resources that actually can be really helpful in developing a read across assessment. And I've highlighted and underlined developing because there's a kind of a distinction between what are your steps to develop a read across versus what might be some of the aspects that you consider after you've developed the read across and really assess how confident you are in the read across prediction and assessment that you're trying to make. So I've highlighted a couple of examples here. There's an extensive amount of guidance that's been developed and published by both the OECD and ECHA. In fact, when in the run-up to the REACH legislation, ECHA and OECD, or JRC at the time, and OECD got together and really sort of thought about, you know, how can we develop some guidance that's going to be useful not only for REACH but for many other regulatory programs throughout the member states or member countries within the OECD. So we sort of pulled together that group and first of all sort of developed this guidance. The ECHA guidance got published in 2008. The OECD guidance was a little ahead of time and sort of got published the year before. It's been updated in 2014. And since then, you know, there's been a lot of more experience in terms of the use of read across, and ECHA have been publishing a number of practical guides that sort of facilitate industry registrants in terms of how one might go about pulling together such a read across type of assessment. However, in the course of that, there's been, you know, an awful lot of interest in this area, and there's been many public papers that have been published that really complement and augment this regulatory type of guidance that's available for the development of read across. And I've highlighted here one example from Nina Wang et al. That was published back in 2012, which looked at sort of how read across is used within the EPA's Superfund risk assessment framework. And PPRTV stands for Provisional Peer Reviewed Toxicity Values. So within the Superfund program, if these values are used to make decisions for waste site cleanups, and if we don't have a particular value, then maybe we wish to use an analog to infer that type of value, and they've described the approach that's used in this context. So it's not regulatory guidance per se, but it's really sort of gives you some insight in terms of how read across is used in for other regulatory purposes. Next slide. Next slide. Yeah, thank you. So along with some of those regulatory technical guidance documents that exist, there's an awful lot of literature also that's been developed. So Within industry, a work group was constructed under ECHA to look at the state of the art for read across and category approaches, and really sort of pull together some guiding principles for industry registrants to use at the time for REACH. This was published in 2012. We extracted out a manuscript that sort of summarized most of the main learnings from that ECHA report, and that was sort of published in 2013. And subsequent to that, there was work by the CEFIC LRI group, and there was a follow-up paper that was in 2015. P&G had pulled together their internal process for how they use read across in their product stewardship processes, and that framework was published in 2010. And since then, as we've sort of seen some experiences in how read across is being used, a different group that was sort of set up by the Center for Animal Alternatives, CAT, they convened a working group with stakeholders from academia, from government, from industry to try and again synthesize what was the state of the art of read across. Could we pull together some good read across practice? And there was a publication there in 2016. So this really sort of highlights some of the avenues, some of the progress that's been made to really sort of pull together, you know, what's out there that we can use to help sort of develop read across. And on the next slide, I've just sort of highlighted what these workflows might look like. There's the workflow that's sort of replicated in the ECHA and the OECD guidance documents, and that's sort of on the first graphic. If we move to the next slide, we see what the initial figure is for the workflow that the Wu et al. Publication discusses, and on the next slide I talk about the workflow that we had published back in sort of 2013 and 2015 that kind of outlined, you know, what are the steps that one might go through to start to develop a read across workflow. And on the face of it, you know, I've highlighted a few examples here, and if you're a new person coming in to start to investigate and want to apply and develop sort of read across, it can be quite an overwhelming sort of task. Where do you start? How do these different frameworks compare to each other? And on the next slide, what we've tried to do here is sort of summarize some of these different frameworks and put them into context side by side. What are they intended to help to develop? What is the problem that they're trying to address? What is the approaches that have been sort of outlined? In some respects, when you look at some of these different articles and guidances, you know, we've defined in our webinar how a substance of interest is named a target, and an analog that you wish to use information of is called a source. But when you read some of these other articles, you know, we might refer to those as chemicals of concern or surrogates or just analogs versus not just a source analog. And I think that can be quite confusing. So what we've tried to do here is just sort of provide a bit of a flavor of how these frameworks compare and contrast. And when you delve into more of the detail, you actually sort of find that there's an awful lot of, next slide, an awful lot of similarity between these different frameworks, and maybe that provides some respite that it's not as overwhelming as it first might appear. Nonetheless, when we start going down and developing read across, we've identified a number of issues, and that really sort of issues in terms of when read across is or isn't accepted, especially in a regulatory context. So next slide. And here I've just sort of tried to outline a few examples of where we have issues and maybe what is the path forward. So there's a lot of guidance out there, a lot of publications out there that sort of describe ways in which one can develop a read across assessment. And nonetheless, even though there's an awful lot out there, acceptance still remains an issue. And as we sort of drill down and discuss this in these different groups, whether it be at OECD or these different industry groups or the CAT group, The one thing that comes up time and time again is the issue that we believe that's really thwarting acceptance is related to, what's the uncertainty associated with the read across. And we've spent many efforts in these different groups really sort of trying to get a handle of what are the sources of uncertainty in the read across, what are ways in which we can be more consistent in how we characterize those uncertainties, and what might be practical ways forward that we can really resolve and address and even reduce some of those uncertainties. So what's really holding us back, and can we get a better handle on that so we can move forward and start to exploit these tools even more than they are so far. And notable as part of these efforts is really, we have frameworks for developing read across, and now we've seen in the last few years really an effort to develop frameworks to help assess the confidence that we have in a read across, and that really sort of starts to provide a means by which we can structure that type of assessment so it doesn't seem so overwhelming of like, what are the, why is this read across not sufficiently confident to be relied upon? Can we break that down and really sort of understand where the sources of uncertainty are, and where do we need to drill down and beef those up so they stand for greater scrutiny. So next slide. So what are some of the sources of uncertainty in read across? Here are some examples. It's probably not exhaustive, but I think it kind of captures the flavor of some of those sources. Whether in mind you have an analog approach where we only have really the target and the source chemical, or whether we have a category approach and those categories can be, maybe 3 members, or they can be much more extensive. Is that a source of uncertainty? Maybe you're more confident if you have more members in a category in making inferences rather than having and doing an extrapolation just from one substance. How complete is your data matrix? If you have a category and you have many gaps in that data matrix, you don't have as much anchoring data to substantiate the confidence you have between making those inferences. So that again is a source of uncertainty. We talk an awful lot in regular risk assessment about the underlying quality of the data that we're using for our substance of interest. The same thing really comes to light in terms of doing a read across, that one has to pay a lot of attention to the underlying data that we have for both the target chemical and the source analogs that we're going to be relying on to use to make those sorts of inferences. Do we have consistency in that data matrix? So, when we're looking across a category and looking at those different members, are we seeing some agreement, for not only the effects, but the potency of those effects across those different category members? Does that provide us some confidence that we can rely upon a prediction that we're making for our target substance? And so the list goes on. I want to draw attention in particular to the one of the last. We talked about toxicokinetics as being something that's even more important perhaps than it was originally in read across. We're seeing time and time again in some of the discussions that oftentimes we might create a category on the basis of structural similarity, but in a way in which we might want to justify that category and be confident that it makes sense to compare and group these chemicals together. We might want to see some toxicokinetic type of information. And I believe under the REACH system, that type of information hasn't traditionally been a requirement per se, and that provides a challenge in the sense that if one wishes to use a read across, what additional information might need to be provided or generated that was perhaps not a particular requirement per se. I also want to draw attention to the issue of dissimilarity. So, all along we've talked very much about the similarity of chemicals to each other, but we should be mindful too of how different can chemicals be, and what impact that those differences might be in terms of driving the toxicity profile of any given category member. So those are things that are worth bearing in mind. So if I've outlined now sort of some of these sources of uncertainty, let's move on and talk about some of the frameworks that have been now pulled together by different researchers to try and help that structured assessment of our confidence in a read-across prediction. So next slide, please. And here we've sort of highlighted a few examples. Again, I'm sure it's not entirely exhaustive. There was a nice publication back from P&G again, Karen Blackburn and Sharon Stewart back in 2014 that sort of provided a framework for assessing read across. The work I've published back in 2015 as a follow-up of the ECHA work under the auspices of Cefic LRI. We also talked an awful lot about ways and strategies and practical things that one could do to assess and enhance read across. The work under SURAP that Mark was heavily involved in with Terry Schultz published a series of strategies to sort of outline how one would go about structuring reporting read across, and then of course there's the RAF, or the read across assessment framework that ECHA published first in 2015 and subsequently in 2017. I have a few slides that sort of drill down to each of those in a little bit more detail, but the overarching thing that I think is very important to bear in mind with these is these frameworks really help to identify our sources of uncertainty, ways in which we can document them, and start to address the issue of how do we resolve some of the uncertainties associated with read across and the predictions that we're making. So on slide, the next slide, please. So here, and next again. So here I've taken a couple of screenshots from the publication from Blackburn and Stewart to sort of give you a flavor of some aspects that are reflected in this assessment framework. And really, it comprises three parts. There's a part that sort of starts to address, the suitability of an analog. So really, the publication I referenced a few slides ago by Wu et al. Outlined a framework for developing an analog approach in terms of what are the considerations one should bear in mind for looking and starting to evaluate an analog. And that aspect is really replicated in this assessment framework to say, can I ask some key questions about the suitability of some analogs? What are the considerations there? A next part is then really looking at the quality and the consistency of the data for those source analogs. And part 3 starts to address the question of, okay, now I think I'm confident with my analogs and I think they're reasonable ones to use. Now I've looked at the data and I'm happy that that's the best data that I can pull together for those analogs. How does that data square up? And am I seeing some consistency and agreement for those analogs relative to the target chemical for which we're trying to make a prediction? So the assessment is those 3 parts, and it provides you with a logical workflow to go through each of those sort of elements in this questionnaire type evaluation form. And that's articulated in a lot more detail in the publication itself. If you scroll to the next slide, I think there's another pop-up or another figure that should show. This is taken from our 2015 paper where, again, we're highlighting some of the same sources of uncertainty associated with read across, and we really structure them in 2 different parts. What are sources of uncertainty associated with the context of similarity by which we're trying to group chemicals, and what are the sources of uncertainty associated with the underlying data? So on the table here, we're just sort of outlining, what are some of the issues around the data? What are some of the issues, considerations around the similarity rationale? These are our sources of uncertainty. What might be ways in which we can address those? And further in the publication, we articulate, almost a workflow of, if you have this type of uncertainty, what might be practical things that you can explore to reduce and enhance your confidence in the read across prediction. And we highlight some examples in terms of what type of high throughput or metabolic investigations that could be done, or what in silico tools could be used to bring to bear to the assessment and the justification that's prepared for the read across. So those are two examples. The third then is we outlined and talked about the work by Terry Schultz and Mark and many others. So next slide. And this was again extensive work to really outline a strategy for how to structure and report a read across, and take into account very much the what we're going to talk about later, or Mark will talk about later, in terms of mechanistic information that can be captured in adverse outcome pathways. So the strategy itself really sort of defined a number of different read across scenarios, and then really tackled two aspects. You know, the assessment of the similarity of the source substances, and assessment of the mechanistic relevance and the completeness of the read across. And in doing the latter, it really sort of explored a number of the same factors: the number of analogs, the quality of the underlying data. Are we seeing consistency and correspondence between the data for those analogs relative to the target chemical, and so on and so forth. And overall, there was a scheme to provide a qualitative score of what the associated confidence was with the read across once it had been done, and whether it was low confidence or medium confidence or high confidence in the read across. There's a huge amount of work within that paper that outlines different templates to help a user really drill down and go through in a systematic way ways in which this evaluation and documentation can be undertaken. There's a lot of similarity too between this and in many respects the RAF that's on the next slide. And here we've borrowed a nice graphic from WCA Environment that kind of just articulated very nicely what the RAF really looks like. And there's again, in a similar way to the Schultz and et al. Publication, there's a number of different read across scenarios that can be taken into account. Some of these are related to an analog approach. Most are related to a category approach. And for each scenario, there's a number of scientific considerations that have been outlined. And I articulate those in more detail on the next slide. But essentially, if you think about these different scenarios, each of those has a number of considerations. And then each is in turn that those are associated with so-called assessment elements. And those assessment elements can be scored from 1 to 5. So if you have a 5 score, that would be acceptable with high confidence. If you have a 1, that would be not acceptable. And those scores are then termed assessment options. And the name of the game, in a way, is to develop a read across, and when you're going through and assessing it, you need a minimum score of 3 to be confident that read across will be taken up and can then be used to inform decision making. And what we find when you drill down and explore and read the RAF in much more detail, that there are a number of assessment elements that are common to all these different scenarios, and there's some that are much more specific to a particular scenario. And those are sort of wrapped up together in order to make that call, and you can understand then, you know, where in that architecture, where in that hierarchy, where are your weak points that you need to hone in and focus on. If you see that doesn't stand up to scrutiny, and you're more likely to rate it a 2 or a 1. Lots more detail in the publication. And what I should add in a sense is all these different publications and guidance documents we've cited in the useful links at the end of this webinar that you can drill down and explore for yourselves in more detail. So next slide. What I wanted to do here in a similar way as I had done for the If you move on to the next slide, please. What I wanted to do here in a similar way that I had done for the development of read across was really to look at some of these frameworks again side by side. What was their original context? What's their scope? What does the framework really encompass? This is just an extract from a table, but when you start drilling down and comparing them side by side in this sort of manner, you quickly find that actually there's quite, again, a lot of commonality between these different frameworks. So from a user first coming in and looking at read across and wanting to use it, it can be a little overwhelming. When you start drilling down and looking at these things, actually there's quite a lot of commonality between these different frameworks, and perhaps it's not as overwhelming as first thought. So again, just if you move to the next slide, I think I just summarized that in a little graphic. What I do want to say too is Mark and I have been working actively to try and summarize some of these different frameworks, both for the development and the assessment of read across, and really sort of lay this out in much more detail. So, you know, in time, look out for a review article that's about to be submitted. Okay, next slide then. So despite the fact that we have all these development frameworks and we have these assessment frameworks now that sort of provide a means of structuring and really working through and understanding where are the shortcomings with a read across assessment, you know, we still have to face the issue of, well, you know, now that we have a way of probing, now that we understand what the sources of our uncertainty might be, how do we go about assessing or addressing those uncertainties? In the Blackburn and Stewart publication, what those researchers had done was, you know, look at all those aspects, make a determination where there was high or low or moderate confidence, and accordingly adjust what the read across prediction would be with an appropriate assessment factor. And that's commonplace in standard sort of risk assessment to do. In the RAF, and indeed the work by Schultz et al., there was much greater call to use what we term new approach methods, using in vitro high throughput screening data or other in silico data to really address and reduce that uncertainty and enhance the scientific confidence of that read across prediction. And there's been a number of examples of that type of exercise being undertaken by Schultz and colleagues. And there's a nice publication that Mark and Terry published in 2017 that looked at some of the SURAT Cosmos examples and described some of the lessons learned from looking at repeated dose toxicity read across predictions and how this new approach method data could be used to improve the read across predictions. However, many of these examples actually sort of rely on more of a qualitative use of NAM data and really much more in the context of an organizing framework such as an adverse outcome pathway. And again, Mark will talk a lot more about this in part 2 of this webinar. The intention with using an ALP is it provides some context of what's the appropriate context for interpreting some of that information in that framework. However, other researchers have looked at exploring how we can use NAM data in a more quantitative form, and indeed work I've been involved in has looked at trying to quantify uncertainties of read across and look at the performance of read across using NAM data in conjunction with chemical structure data, and our own work has led to an approach called generalized read across, where we're developing a read across in a QSAR-like framework rather than a traditional expert judgment read across. I think on the slide some of the text has come out with the logo, but the last bullet point there is really alluding to a lot of these types of approaches, not just the generalized read across general approach or the work by others. A lot of aspects have been incorporated into different read-across tools. So on the next slide and the subsequent slides, I want to highlight some of the available tools that exist. This is not an exhaustive list by any stretch of the imagination. I honed in on a selection of different tools, primarily because all of these were available in the public domain, and they weren't commercial, and there were things I could look at and try out and sort of do a comparison against. So here again is just a tabulation of those side by side. I find it really helpful to look at, you know, here's a tool, how does it compare to the next tool? Where are its strengths and weaknesses? Is it the sense, or at least I have the sense from exploring these different tools, that, you know, there is no one tool that you can use. There's no golden chalice of a particular tool. Each tool that's out there has its own particular utility, and perhaps the best strategy is to use a combination of these different tools together. On the first column of this table, what I've tried to do, or at least sort of provide a structure to make that kind of comparison, and I've outlined the different steps, largely taking from those different development read-across frameworks that I talked about a little earlier. So the aspect of, you know, the approach of looking for analogs, the aspect of trying to evaluate the suitability of those particular analogs. What does our data gap matrix look like? What are the ways in which we can fill data gaps within that matrix? We've talked a lot about QSARs. We've talked about doing a read across. You know, those are some of the data gap approaches that can be used to fill these gaps within a category approach. We've talked somewhat about uncertainty assessment, and, you know, here's where some of these tools fall short a little bit to the extent in which they can help provide some meat to do that type of assessment within a read across. And on the bottom, I made a point of saying, well, you know, all of these tools are essentially free for use and can be either downloaded or used on a web interface, with exception to the tool that we've been developing, which we hope to release later this year. But here is just an outline of what their different capabilities are. We describe these in a little bit more detail in a review publication, which is referenced on the next slide. So if you want to drill down and see a little bit more, we describe each of these tools in this context and talk about where you can access them, how they tend to work, and, you know, how do they compare and contrast against each other. So on the next few slides, what I have is a few screenshots to give you a flavor of what these tools actually look like in practice. They're very different from each other. The first one I wanted to highlight is the OECD QSAR Toolbox. This is really a tool that is more than just read across. It's quite a comprehensive tool itself, and it's really designed to help in the development, evaluation, justification, and documentation of chemical categories for read across. And the software really mimics, when you look at the interface, and I have that on the next slide, really mimics the steps that are applicated in the OECD and the ECHA guidance for categories. There are a number of regulatory entries that are encoded in the toolbox. There are so-called profilers that encode structure alert type of information, which in a sense represent, in many cases, these molecular initiating events within adverse outcome pathways. The profilers are designed to address, you know, from structural similarity aspects through to more mechanistic basis for grouping chemicals, and the types of endpoints that have greatest focus on within the toolbox are really tackling some of the more easier endpoints to, for want of a better word, that looks at sort of gene tox endpoints in terms of DNA binding, or skin sensitization types of endpoints where we have profilers for protein binding, or aquatic toxicity type of endpoints, and there are profilers that try and encode the mode of action information associated with that. So in a sense, a lot of the capability within the toolbox is perhaps a little bit more biased towards those types of endpoints where, you know, there's a lot more knowledge and experience on how to group chemicals together and what QSARs might be available that facilitate that type of process. But this toolbox is ongoing in its development. There's a lot more capability that's in there. We've highlighted here just a couple of avenues of where some of the current focus is on implementing ALPs within the toolbox that are going to be much more useful for addressing repeated dose toxicity endpoints. And as a proof of concept, in a sense, the first ALP that was actually implemented in the toolbox, and I think that was really made available back in 2014, was the ALP for skin sensitization. So on the next slide, I just wanted to show you what that interface really looks like. It can be a little daunting to first begin with. On the top, you can see various boxes that sort of depict that workflow. Within the data matrix view, you can see the target as being the first column, the first chemical. You know, where you have no information, that represents your data gap. The other chemicals that are listed there really represent your source substances that you're going to use to make inferences for your target. And on the very left-hand side, you can see different grouping methods where some of these profilers appear. And here are, in many cases, some of your endpoint-specific similarity rationales that you could use to help subcategorize or start to identify analogs to group again to begin with. So next slide. So another tool that I had in the table was a tool called ToxMatch, which was first commissioned by the JRC using in conjunction with IATA Consult in Sofia, Bulgaria. We developed this ToxMatch tool as an intent to facilitate endpoint-specific read across. The infrastructure here is very different to the OECD toolbox itself, but many of the same elements in terms of looking for analogs, trying to evaluate them, quantifying how similar a chemical is from its source chemical, and providing that type of data is replicated here, albeit in a very different way. So on the screen, you can see, you know, your target chemical in the bottom half, your source chemical in the top half, a matrix of the pairwise similarity scores. So there's different ways in which you can characterize your chemicals and quantify how similar they are with respect to each other. And from there, you can drill down and start to select, you know, which are the chemicals that are most similar based on this quantitative metric in order to do a further exploration and make some read-across predictions. On the next slide, there's a tool that was developed by Emilio Benfanati and his team at Mario Negri Institute in Milan in Italy, called ToxRead. And this is really quite a novel approach too. It looks at your target chemical in the center, identifying chemicals that are structurally similar to each other, and they're represented sort of around that target chemical. The size of the circle represents how similar it is in terms of its structural similarity. But in conjunction with that, one can also explore what are similar analogs on the basis of commonality with respect to a particular structural alert. And in this case, ToxRead is very much tuned into looking at two particular endpoints, one for bioaccumulation factor and the second for Ames mutagenicity. And on the screen here, I've just sort of shown an example looking at the Ames mutagenicity prediction that can be made. And what you have in the center is you have a derived prediction from these different analogs. So the triangles around in that figure represent things that have commonality in structural alerts. If they're red, that means it's a negative alert, representative of a particular hazard. If it's green, it's a positive alert in terms of, we have some information that suggests something isn't going to be a mutagen, and the direction sort of and the shading of those triangles really sort of reflect how confident we are in the underlying prediction model for any one of those structural alerts. So in conjunction, one can summarize all of this, and you can look in and explore what we have for a target and get a prediction for is that target predicted to be an Ames mutagen, yes or no. And in conjunction with that, one can also see what QSAR predictions can be made for that substance at the same time. So it's really trying to come up with a way of generating read-across predictions that are reproducible. One just goes in, you type in a SMILES code, the default number of analogs is 3, and you can see automatically sort of how what is my predicted value, and drill down and explore all the associated information with that. So moving on the next slide, I have a picture of a different tool, which is called the Chemical Biological Read-Across tool that was developed by work from Lau et al. In 2013. Here the notion is to use a means of being able to look for structural analogs on the basis of chemical descriptors, but also on the basis of biological active descriptors. So looking at, say, high throughput data and describing that in a descriptor format, and then looking at that fingerprint and identifying, which chemicals are structurally similar, which are biological similar. Can I use a combination of those two to make an inference about what I expect to see for my target chemical? On the right of that radial plot are chemical analogs. On the left are the biological analogs, and for this particular substance, the ultimate prediction is that there's expected to be some kind of hazard as a result of all those different analogs. And the distance of any one of those analogs relative to the center target chemical represents how similar that source analog is relative to the target chemical on the basis of a score from 0 to 1. So 1 being least similar, and 0 being most similar. And finally, on the last slide, I wanted to draw attention to some of the work that we have done in terms of building on that approach by Lau et al. And the CBRA, and our own investigations we've termed GENRA, or generalized read across. It builds on the same way in which we can derive a read across prediction based on a similarity weighted activity of these nearest neighbors. So on the graphic there, we have in the red a target chemical. Around that are our source analogs. We can weight them based on their similarity score and their activity, and derive an average, if you like, a similarity weighted average of what we believe our target chemical should be predicted to be. And the approach that we used here was really in an effort to try and understand, if we're looking at a large number of chemicals and we don't want to do an extensive expert-driven approach for each one in turn, what is a pragmatic way in which we can generalize read across, do it in a more systematic and reproducible manner for a large number of chemicals, but at the same time get an essence of how good our read across predictions are and how confident might we be with them. So the approach that we had here, if you go on to the next slide, and I just have a couple of slides here, is to really pull together what information did we have on chemicals, what structural descriptors could we generate, what high throughput data did we have from ToxCast, and look at the overlap between that and for which chemicals we actually had in vivo apical outcome data from different repeated dose studies. And then could we group those chemicals together in pragmatic groups in order to investigate and make these similarity weighted activity scores and evaluate the impact of, if I look at my read across prediction, do I do a better job of that if I just use structural descriptors? Do I do a better job if I just use biological data? or do I do a better job if I use a combination of the both? And there isn't a clear-cut answer that we found with doing this, but we could see, you know, when you start drilling down and looking at a particular chemical group each in turn, in some cases biological descriptors were better, in other cases chemical descriptors were better, but we could start to see, you know, how good or how bad these read-across predictions could look like, and how could we tailor and incorporate in a more systematic manner other aspects of similarity in that type of evaluation. That's really the current focus of our work. Given the progress we've made in that, obviously we're interested in providing this as a resource for the community to use. So like all the other tools we've mentioned, this is another tool that's in the pipeline to be released. And on the next slide, I just wanted to show you what this looks like in terms of several screenshots. We're trying to provide a means of being able to access this through the chemistry dashboard that Mark showed earlier. It would just be a tab within that framework. We want to make it more interactive, yet provide some consistency in terms of assuring predictions are made that are reproducible. So it sort of follows that workflow that we discussed many slides ago. So there's aspects of showing that data matrix that I think is very important in terms of being able to, you know, explore and work through the workflow in order to derive some sense of, does that make sense based on the chemicals that are being used to make that prediction. So if you just scroll on to the next slide, I think you have a view of some of the other aspects. So we have a view that shows you, here's our target chemical in the center of this radial plot. Here are our source analogs. Here we can summarize the available data based on the study type, the colors representing the density of data that might be available. And if we scroll to the next slide, we can start to sort of tease that apart in terms of what does that look like in a data matrix, and blue meaning an adverse effect, green meaning a negative effect. Can we update that information in the first column, which is our target, in order to make a prediction? So that's just a teaser of what's to come. So I think on that note, I'm handing back over to Mark to continue in part 2.
Thank you, Grace. And whilst this is a slightly different part to this webinar, it fits in very well. And what I hope you're seeing is that the whole area of computation in silico toxicology has moved on from a very simplistic understanding of how chemical structure affects toxicology, how we can capture and apply that, through to a much broader appreciation of similarities in structure and supporting this by multiple strands of evidence. And this leads us very nicely into the second part of the webinar, which is attempts to give an introduction to a concept called integrated approaches to testing and IR and assessment. And I'm going to simply just use the term IATA here to represent integrated approaches to testing and assessment, and I assume Grace will in her part of the webinar as well. And IATA has been taken up at various levels, including at the OECD, and the definition is given there, and possibly the first line of the first bullet point is the most important. It's a means of organizing and analyzing all available relevant data. And what I'll do in the next few slides is just discuss what those data may be, where you may obtain them from, and how we can begin to organize them in terms of a mechanistic framework supported in this case by the AOPs. We also have within the IATA the applications of them, including, but not only, integrated testing strategies, and Grace will talk more about defined approaches. But ITS, or integrated testing strategies, are approaches that allow us to to bring together these different types of data and make decisions from them. And as we'll see, they may be individual assays, they may be combinations of assays in test batteries or tiered schemes, and they may incorporate issues such as weight of evidence. There's a link there to read more about ITS. I think it's very true to say that as we develop more IATA and extract from them usable ITS, whether or not they're based around AOP type frameworks, these will be individual, they'll be very specific at times to the endpoint we're trying to address, and maybe even chemical specific. For instance, if we're dealing with volatile substances or poorly soluble substances. So in the next slide, I just bring together a couple more points. So the concept of IATA is really to integrate data, and this may include existing in vivo data, and also certainly any non-test data. And it may enable you to make a decision directly, or it may direct you into the being able to find out which data you need in order to make those decisions. And as I said, all IATA are likely to be different to a certain extent, and some will be relatively simplistic, others much more complex. But the general building blocks we'll look at it in a moment evolve around a strategy of considering existing data, non-test data such as in vitro or in silico data, before considering in vivo testing at all. So in this context, we're putting it in the thought that non-testing approaches such as computational approaches, as we've been describing, but also in other webinars you'll hear more about in vitro approaches, do fit within these IATA schemes, but we shouldn't be considering these non-testing approaches in isolation. So we should be supporting information from, where possible, supporting in vitro information with in silico information and vice versa. And this builds up a little bit on where Grace ended up in her last few examples of the combination that is now possible as we build up evidence of a biological or mechanistic basis along with properties from chemical structure. So in the next slide, we just summarize the information that may be used within an IATA. And I've verbalized much of this already. So part of this will be historical information on the chemical of interest. So we may go to some of the publicly available databases to find out information on the chemical itself, and possibly also information on similar chemicals. We may find out that there is sufficient information at that point, and that may be sufficient to make a decision. We may also find information on non-standard in vivo tests. So for instance, historical tests that may not have been performed to OECD guidelines or GLP, but may still provide valid data and information. As I said, should there be insufficient data, we may want to instigate a process analogous to read across, finding information on similar chemicals, and we've heard how to do that. We can also make predictions from other computational approaches such as SARs, the use of structural alerts, or QSARs. So all of that can be done without the chemical itself. That can be done purely from chemical structure and access to relevant databases and software. But you may also be able to supplement information within chemico tests, by which we mean reactivity tests, an example being the direct protein reactivity assay, the DIPRO for skin sensitization, or some of the other protein reactivity assays. Of course, in vitro data, and then supporting it as well through molecular biology and any high content or high throughput type data and omics data. And lastly, and as I alluded to at the start of the webinar, we're considering now more the role of exposure, how we can make decisions based on exposure and use scenarios themselves. There's also the information that may be provided by models or in vitro measurements of biokinetics. So the process of the IATA is a means of organizing and utilizing all of this information, not all of which you may have. Next slide. So to develop and utilize an IATA, we have presented here a general framework, and there's a number of situations or a number of decisions that we need to make. The first of all, you'll see in the top box, the process of a problem formulation. And this is important. We need to define the regulatory need and the type of information and confidence that is going to be required to make that regulatory decision. That will direct the type of information we can use and the level of uncertainty or certainty that may be acceptable. Following on from that is the process of gathering and evaluating existing information. So the use of existing in vivo data, in vitro data, gathering in silico or making in silico predictions and read across and so forth. And that's at the heart of the IATA approach. From that, we need to make some kind of weight of evidence assessment through, as I mentioned, an integrated testing strategy or similar. And then that may give us sufficient information and sufficient evidence to make a decision. If it doesn't, then we'd have to consider how we can supplement that, preferably with non-test data, to be able to make the decision that we require. Again, that would re-enter the integrated testing strategy to enable a weight of evidence assessment to be made. So this is the general workflow within IATA, and a core of this is gathering data, also evaluating the data and seeing whether they're fit to make the purpose that we need. So we need assistance in this general framework on being able to pull the relevant data together, as well as being able to make a decision from those data. So next slide. Here we begin to consider the use of mechanistic-based information and focusing in on the adverse outcome pathway concept. So we're familiar now with this webinar of the shift towards non-animal alternatives, and also we began to see through Grace's section of the webinar and read across the need to integrate different types of data. Grace also introduced the concept of new approach methods or methodologies as a means of supporting this. And here we take it very much in the spirit of being non-test data. So there is at the moment, no currently accepted formal definition of new approach methodologies, but we take them to mean in silico data, in vitro data, in chemico data. We can also use here, as we've alluded to in terms of IATA, existing in vivo data or non-standard in vivo data or in vivo data from other endpoints or similar chemicals. So we've collected data together, and adverse outcome pathways, as we'll present, serve as a way of organizing that information. And Grace will emphasize this later with a specific example on skin sensitization. And I have a further slide on adverse outcome pathways, but it's clear that they're providing us a framework to organize information, and they provide us this framework that takes us from the chemistry through the initial interaction of the chemical with the biology, termed the molecular initiating event, to understanding how that, through a series of key events, elicits the adverse effect. And as we've been saying, particularly in the middle section of this webinar, data from these key events will help us bring together a weight of evidence and has been useful. And Grace has alluded to some of the recent case studies, is useful to support aspects such as read across. So the next slide is just a very well used graphic of an adverse outcome pathway. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through this. We've already said it takes us through from the chemical and the chemistry, through the interaction, through to an adverse effect. And here we've actually gone up to a population response. Sometimes in human health, or usually in human health toxicology, we'd end at the organism response, or even earlier than that, the organ level response. The AOP, we're becoming more and more familiar with, but organizes this information in terms of key events, which are linked together by key event relationships. And for our purposes of finding information, it's the assays that are relevant to each of these key events, or a collection of key events, and the information from the assays that are relevant that becomes very important to us. So if we're trying to make an assessment for a particular adverse outcome, the adverse outcome pathway provides us a way of organizing and rationalizing information that may come from in vitro assays or binding assays or high content type information, which can then be put in this framework and we can draw it out. Another way of looking at this is presented on the next slide, which is the development of AOP-informed IATA. So our way of collecting together information, the IATA, which could include QSARs, read across, integrated testing strategy, requires us to make that decision. So the first process in this often is to make a decision and an assessment of the existing data, the historical data we've talked about in terms of databases, the type of data that's available, and whether there is, make a decision at that point as to whether the existing data are sufficient to make the decision for the particular regulatory purpose that's being required. If they're not, or even at that point, we can consider that for the endpoint and the chemical of interest, can we support that with an AOP? So is there an adverse outcome pathway providing this mechanistic basis and foundation for making a decision that is relevant to this? And can we use the AOP to identify particular information that may assist us in making a decision on for a regulatory endpoint? And also putting in the mix here is the term here, adequate, becomes very important. Is the information within the IATA or the ITS that may be supported by the AOP and may vitally be supported by the AOP, is that adequate to make any of the regulatory applications that we've gone there, that we've listed there? So for instance, going from screening through prioritization, classification and labeling down to risk assessment, we're going to require greater confidence, usually require greater confidence as we go down that. And just as a reminder that the use of the AOP is that it's providing a framework that enables us to put greater confidence in a decision for a particular adverse outcome. So on the next slide, we pull some of this information together, and this is very similar. It's a graphic really of the general framework I showed earlier. But now we can see, in terms of our problem formulation, we have our data gathering exercise and weight of evidence assessment, and then gathering of further information. And the role of the AOP is to support both the gathering of existing information as well as informing the weight of evidence. So if we have multiple streams of evidence, does the AOP support that? And how can the AOP identify further information that may need to be generated? So the next slide. And the next one. So here we can see how the AOP may underpin the foundation of an IATA and give a mechanistic basis to the information gathering and the weight of evidence. And here now you can see the kinds of information that may be included. And it can be multiple strands of information. They may be in-house data, they may be non-standard in vivo data, they may indeed be non-standard in vitro or omics type databases. They can also be in silico type data. And of course, as part of weight of evidence assessment, we do need to include expert judgment, and that needs to be made in terms of the chemicals that's being analysed, the endpoint, as well as the regulatory or other need that's being made from it. And the aim here is to use this basis and this general formation to enable us to pull together sufficient evidence to make the appropriate decision. So at this point, I'll hand back to Grace, and she's going to take you through some more specifics about how to utilize this approach.
Thanks, Mark. So bear in mind that we make a point of talking about weight of evidence assessment. In the general framework for an IATA that Mark has sort of already shown, and in this last slide too, we have this step where we talk about make a weight of evidence assessment or apply a predefined decision criteria such as an ITS or an STS. And in light of that, this slide is sort of trying to provide a different way in which we can work towards using a weight of evidence, but in a more reproducible and systematic and objective manner. And the way in which this has been defined, no pun intended, is a defined approach. To put a bit of context on this, so the first AOP that was sort of developed under the OECD work program was the AOP for skin sensitization. And when that first got sort of developed, there was a lot of interest and a lot of discussion around, well, how would we apply this AOP in practice for some regulatory purpose? And that sort of led to a lot of discussions and a workshop that sort of talked about IATAs, which have been around for a long time, but how would we incorporate this mechanistic information in an IATA? So a decision was made within the OECD work program is, well, can we apply that as a proof of concept example? Could we look to see how would we use the AOP for skin sensitization to develop IATA? And a working group, a drafting group was established, and different stakeholders within that drafting group worked to develop their own IATA for skin sensitization. And we had some 12 or so different sort of case studies. And as we work through that and try to come up with, some guiding principles of how to structure and document IATA, it became quite clear that, some of these examples were more defined in nature and objective versus some that were more weight of evidence in nature. And in terms of trying to resolve some of that difficulty within those different examples, we coined a new term called defined approach to take into account these types of IATA that weren't really considering all those other aspects within an IATA that Mark has talked about in terms of the problem formulation and gathering all the different existing information. But, are there aspects that sort of help to integrate that information together, and can we tease that apart and look to see how that can be structured? So we call them defined approaches. The essence there was really this is a fixed data interpretation procedure, or a DIP. And that was really looking at different pieces of information. How would we synthesize those together to address a specific regulatory need? And a guidance document was written to try and outline and describe what we meant by a defined approach and provide some guiding principles around that, to provide some help in terms of, if one was deriving and developing a defined approach, what are the information components that need to be described? What are the ways in which that information needs to be integrated together? How would we assess the confidence associated or identify the uncertainties with the overall defined approach that was derived? And then a subsequent guidance document that was developed was really looking at some of those general principles and how did we apply them for the skin sensitization endpoint. And that's why there's these two parts of the guidance document. Originally, we intended to have one big one, and then we split them up into two to tease out what were the general steps that will be applicable to any defined approach, and how had we specifically addressed that for the skin sensitization endpoint. These two documents and these definitions are provided on the OECD website. We have a link in the useful links guide that sort of provide a bit more of the story and the context and the background, and here we're just sort of providing a bit of an overview. So if we then think about a defined approach, one of the reasons that we were kind of interested in this as a notion is it sort of takes away some of the expert judgment. It's, you know, we know that we're going to get a reproducible same answer that you get if you combine these different types of approaches. And for some stakeholders, this was of particular interest because if we go to the next slide, there was some interest in having some almost certainty or some confidence that if we combine different pieces of data together in a particular manner, and we were getting the same answer, that could be a substitute for, there was some certainty about getting the same answer, and that could be used as a substitute for doing a particular test. So there's a lot of discussion and work now ongoing within the OECD to try and establish what's known as performance-based defined approaches for skin sensitization. And the reason for doing that is twofold. One, particularly in say under the remit of REACH, if we're trying to address skin sensitization as an information requirement, is there a way in which we combine these different key event pieces of information that from different tests that characterize all those different key events? Can we combine and integrate that in a fixed manner that we have some certainty of what the answer would be, and there's no gray area in terms of how that data might necessarily be interpreted, or at least the algorithm will be reproducible and transparent. So the idea here was to try and look at ways in which, if one had derived a defined approach, could we assess its performance based on a reference data set? And if that defined approach gave rise to a comparable performance to other defined approaches that are already been through the exercise as described in this guidance document, then we don't have to necessarily go through a formalized, lengthy validation process for this defined approach to be used for regulatory purposes. And at the same time, that would mean that we could substitute any animal testing for this endpoint based on this combination of different methods within this defined approach. Now, that might make a lot more sense when we look at the next slide. So if we go back and look at the next slide, what we have here, and if you can keep clicking, what we have here is the ALP for skin sensitization that got first published in 2012 within the OECD framework. And you can see in the same manner in terms of the ALP that Mark had presented in one of the earlier slides, we have these different key events going from chemical structure to molecular initiating event through to the organism response. We can see which target organs is implicated at each sort of step. And we can start looking at that ALP framework, but start to consider what are different test methods that characterize those different key events. And in the sensitization arena, there's been a tremendous amount of work to develop these in chemical and in vitro test methods that mimic these different sort of steps. So for the molecular initiating event, there are assays that look at peptide depletion or adduct formation or relative reactivity rate. For these different cellular responses, there are assays now that look at dendritic cell activation or activation of keratinescence sites. And to that extent, can we combine and use that information in an integrated way and represent it in a defined approach. And the reason for that, and in part, is to move away from some of the expert judgment and have some degree of confidence of the outcome that one is going to get. So this slide here sort of outlines, some of the most well-established non-animal methods that exist to characterize these different key events for skin sensitization. Some of these test methods now have OECD guidelines associated with those. You'll see if you look at the updated REACH guidance in Chapter 7A that there's a lot more description in terms of how some of these test methods can be used and in conjunction with each other. And that's also reflected in the test guidelines itself in terms of how we might not necessarily use any one test method in isolation, but they're really intended to be used as part of this integrated testing and assessment type of approach. So on the next slide, when we think about, some of the other test methods in this arena that are coming on board, there's even more that are available. And these are the most well established of those, and you can see which has test guidelines and not. So they're the most advanced of all of those that I've listed on the previous slide. If we then think to how we might use and develop these defined approaches, if we look now to the next slide, there's been a slight update in the AOP as has been presented. So on the next slide, now we have a slight change in key event 2 and 3 in the reflection of the AOP. If we then think about how do we combine some of these early events together in order to make inferences about what we expect to see at key event 4 and what is traditionally measured, say, in the local lymph node assay or indeed in the guinea pig tests, can we combine those early key events together in a systematic manner underneath a defined approach? And if you go to the next slide, I think you'll start to see, there are these different test methods, there are non-test methods, they can be used together in defined combinations. We can provide a prediction algorithm or a data interpretation protocol, and that's fixed. And that obviates the need for some expert judgment in a weight of evidence type of approach, and that's kind of reflected in the next bubble. If you move to the next slide. That's not to say that expert judgment goes out of the window entirely, of course, but in this particular case, there are opportunities, and there is, there are good reasons why using a defined approach might be quite appropriate to use in certain circumstances. So, what does a defined approach look like? It's all very well sort of saying it captures the third step of a general framework for an IATA. It's all very well to say that we're combining these different types of key event information, characterizing these different assays together, but these defined approaches can be very simple or they can be very complex. And I have a couple of examples that I've drawn from those case studies that are reflected in the guidance document with for IATA and defined approaches under OECD. On the next slide, there's one simpler example. If you scroll and stop there. So one of the defined approaches that's reflected is an approach that was pulled together by BASF, and they called it their 2 out of 3 approach. And really it was, one can think of this as a majority approach of, if I do a test in one key event assay, so I do a test in the peptide depletion assay, for instance, and then I do a second test, and then I do a third test, I take the best out of 3. So if I have 2 that come out with the same answer suggesting that I have a sensitizer, I can stop there. If I'm getting conflicting results, I'll do a third test and then take the most conservative outcome from that first test. And that really summarizes a 2 out of 3 type of approach. So, it's defined, it's clear in terms of what's the process, what's the context in terms of how that information is going to get interpreted, and one can run, and indeed BASF has run many compounds through this type of scheme in order to derive some performance characteristics and demonstrate, here's how confident we are in terms of making predictions, and here's some of the uncertainties that are associated with this defined approach as we've developed it. In contrast, you can almost go down a continuum of complexity, and this next example is a Bayesian network that was sort of developed within P&G by Joanna Jaworska and colleagues, and this is just sort of providing a representation of this network type of approach, where each of these different nodes is representing one of these key events, and we can look at the interactions between one key event to another, and start to understand, if I look at the probabilities for each of those different nodes and I generate a piece of information, what impact does that have in making me more or less confident about the outcome that I'm trying to predict? And it provides you a tool to look at, the value of information that you might generate when you're using this. So think of this as being like a diagnostic tool that maybe your doctor will use when you present him with a number of different symptoms, and he'll work through that. He's almost going through that in his mind in order to come to a determination of what might be the best course of treatment for you. And this in many ways is sort of quite similar to look at those different pieces, take into account the complementariness between one or other in order to inform what might be the prediction and the probability for seeing an outcome in the sensitization result. So that just gives you a flavor of very contrasting ways in which defined approaches can be undertaken. Within the case studies themselves, there were examples using support vector machines and neural networks through to something quite simplistic like the 2 out of 3 approach. And I would encourage you all to have a look at the OECD website to see some of those examples and get a flavor of how they differ and how these have been described and documented according to these different templates. So on that note, I think we've finished the main part of the webinar. What I wanted to conclude with in sense is to just recap and summarize what we hope are the main learnings and conclusions from all of the slides that we've gone through today. So on the next slide, we've talked a lot about QSARs, how they've been most effectively used for particularly ecotox, physchem, and environment fate type properties as replacement values, and how to many extent QSARs have been used not only for simpler endpoints but as part of a weight of evidence approach for more complex endpoints too. We've talked and outlined the OECD validation principles, and they're an incredibly useful framework not only to develop QSARs but also assess them and demonstrate their scientific validity that can be useful for these different regulatory purposes. They provide the underpinnings for these reporting formats that we talked about, the QMRF and the QPRF, and it provides that structure in terms of documenting the use of these types of models and their predictions. We've outlined and highlighted a few examples of tools that can make predictions, these different expert systems. We've talked about resources where one can go and look for models that have been published, models that have been documented according to these templates, where one might go to find and generate predictions, or indeed find other types of complementary and valuable useful information from toxicity information or physchem or high throughput screening type of information. Where are the resources that you can go and tap into to either to complement work that you're doing or to develop new models yourselves? we've talked about how read across is often used much more for more complex human health related endpoints like the repeated dose toxicity studies, 28-day, 90-day developmental toxicity screening studies, and there, our experience has been that analogs and category approaches have been much more useful, perhaps, in applying those to address those types of endpoints, and QSARs are a helpful component to build different or one line of evidence in that overall weight of evidence approach. We've discussed that there's quite a lot of guidance for read across that's out there, both in the peer-reviewed literature as well as regulatory technical guidance. It can be a little disconcerting to see so much, but when one drills down and compares and contrasts these different frameworks together in terms of how they can be useful for developing a read across, we find actually there's quite a lot of similarity between them. So really they're quite complementary to each other. We've talked about, next slide please, that despite the fact that there is quite a lot of information out there that can aid in developing a read across, acceptance of read across, at least for regulatory purposes, still is an ongoing challenge. We believe that the main reason for that is really sort of drilling down and understanding what are sources of uncertainty and what are practical and pragmatic ways of being able to characterize those uncertainties and resolve them. There are frameworks out there that we've highlighted that provide a means of being able to structure that type of a assessment process, so you can work through and drill down and really identify, what are the problem areas of your read across justification? Where are the weaknesses? Where do you need to fill in the gaps? Are there opportunities in which NAM type of information can be used to really bolster your read across prediction? There have been approaches that have been, and examples that have been published that sort of provide a roadmap, if you like, of how that might be conducted, at least on a qualitative basis. And there's also been a lot of work in the last few years in terms of, are there opportunities to move away from this expert judgment qualitative application of NAM? Are there opportunities to look at how we can quantify the performance of read across and quantify the uncertainties, and to really start to understand to what extent some of these different contexts of similarity or some of these NAM data is, how much is it really impacting and improving the read across that the predictions that we're sort of generating. We've highlighted a number of tools for the development and assessment of read across. It's just a selection of those tools that are publicly available. We have links for you to look for and probe deeper for yourselves, but we've just sort of provided a snapshot and a flavor of some of the range of tools that are available. Some tools are much more extensive, some are more simpler to navigate through, some have a greater focus on structural and chemical information, and others are looking to see how to incorporate other types of biological information in enhancing and making those sorts of read across predictions. And finally, next slide. We've talked about QSARs and read across really as being not something to be used in vacuo, in isolation of themselves, and so made a point of trying to position those as approaches that are forming part of an overall IATA construct. We've talked about ways in which IATA can be constructed. The different stepping stones, there are some commonality in the way in which these can be pulled together, even though sometimes they can look a little different from each other. Although IATA have been around for quite some years, increasingly what we're seeing is IATA being underpinned by mechanistic information such as what's captured in AOPs. We've tried to illustrate the AOP for skin sensitization that's been available since 2012, and what work has been done to try and explore to what extent we can create IATA from the key event information for within the AOP for skin sensitization, particularly since such progress has been made to develop actual assays that characterize those different events on the in vitro and chemico arena. And one aspect that's been of particular interest in those discussions is to look at ways in which those IATA can be developed that kind of formalize and those sort of steps and encompass in these prediction models called defined approaches. Because of the success of that and the will of different regulators within the OECD community, we're finding that there's a strong interest to develop performance standards for defined approaches, so we can move away from a formalized and a very lengthy validation exercise when evaluating different defined approaches for not only skin sensitization, but perhaps in the future for other endpoints. And finally, we've tried to outline and provide a couple of examples of what defined approaches have been developed for skin sensitization and highlight how they can vary very much in their complexity. So on that note, I just want to stop by acknowledging, thanking for your attention, acknowledging all our different colleagues and collaborators. Next slide, please. I'd like to acknowledge a lot of my colleagues at EPA and the National Center for Computational Toxicology. Mark wishes to acknowledge a lot of financial support from the EU and the Chemicals Agency. And in the next few slides that we won't go through because there's far too many, but we have a number of slides that talk about different useful links, links for QSARs, QSAR resources and applicability domain software, links that sort of draw you to what available technical regulatory guidance might exist and where to find it, links to some of the read across tools, where to go and find those that we highlighted, as well as the review paper where we discuss them in much more detail. We have some links that sort of point you to the what I would call, I guess, the state of the art in terms of all the literature or the main sources of literature that we're familiar with for read across in the peer review. So we have a number of links there. And finally, we have links that sort of describe a little bit more about, what AOPs are, what IATA are, what defined approaches are, the websites within the OECD that sort of describe a lot of the work and the program and efforts that are ongoing there, and some of the peer review publications out there that talk a little bit more about how AOPs are developed, how AOPs are applied in practice, and some of the related guidance documents that are available on the OECD website. And on that note, I think I'm handing back over to Christopher.
Grace and Mark, thank you very much for your excellent presentations. I'm sure this information will be of great interest to toxicologists, those registering chemicals, REACH consultants, and companies that want to know more about the use of in silico approaches. I'd like to say a big thank you to our speakers, to everybody watching, and to Chemical Watch for all their support in organizing the webinar series. Next slide, please. I'd also like to remind you about the other webinars in the series and wish you the very best of luck as you go about your work in this field. Do not hesitate to get in touch with the Science Consortium if you need advice on how to avoid testing on animals. Thank you and goodbye.